You are the first caller and will be placed on hold until the next caller arrives.
Hello.
Yes, sir. This is William White.
All right. How are you, Mr. White? I was having a little bit of technical difficulty. That's why it took me a couple extra minutes.
Okay.
Hopefully, Mr. Huff will be here shortly. We'll wait just a minute or two, and then if he doesn't come, well, we'll go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Well, it's 5:35. We'll go ahead. Chapter 14, Leadership Challenges and Organizational Change. And the sub-bullet here is kind of nice. You can't do it alone. So let's look at the questions that we hope to answer as we go through this. What is moral leadership? What is shared leadership? How do you lead across cultures? That's always a very interesting topic. I think you, and I'm not directing this to you to use a general term here, we really have to kind of pay attention to this because it's not a confusing concept, but it's a different concept. And so when you think about this, when listen to the lecture, read the lecture notes, and then read the what's presented in the chapter, I think it'll all come together.
Okay.
And
Dr.
finally,
Reed.
how do
Dr.
you? Hello.
Do you? Yes, sir. Do you have the PowerPoint up?
PowerPoints?
Yes, the
Yes,
PowerPoint.
Yes, they're up right now.
They're not showing up on my screen. It
Well,
just says connect to go to meeting, and I connected, and
yeah,
I have you in the corner.
what I mentioned to you earlier is I had some technical difficulty,
Okay.
and I had to find a different way to get the meeting recorded. I usually have a little button up here that tells me I can record. What I mean by record is the image will show up. Now I've got the image up here on my screen. I can see what I'm saying, but for some reason, the image that I normally get to, what I want to say is capture this, I didn't have. I found another way to record this. Now, as far as I know, I'm going to be able to, I don't want that. As far as I know, I'm going to be able to at least record this. And if you can't see me now, you'll be able to see this tomorrow when I upload it, but I can't promise that 100%. I don't know what happened. There's a little, what I want to say is a little button that I get at the top of my screen that I normally click on to do this, to do the recording, and that was, and it's gone from my screen. I can't tell you where it is.
Yes, sir.
And it's one of these things that I'm gonna look around here and see if I can find it. It's one of these things that I have problems with because I'm not that good at technological stuff. I'm trying to see if I have this here in my. You just hold on here. I'll pull some stuff up. Let me see if I can find this. That will allow me to do the capture. And like I said, it's a little icon that I have that's at the top of my screen, and for some reason it's not appearing, or didn't appear today. I didn't take it off. There's no way I can do that. But I don't know what happened to it, where it went, etc. So I apologize that you can't see this. I don't really know what else to do here. Let me see something. Can you see it now?
No, sir.
Still can't see it.
No, sir.
All right. I don't know what to say here. Trying to figure this out. If I can figure it out, I don't know that I can. I have the well, let me check. Let me try this.
Okay.
That didn't work. Just bear with me a second. Let me see if I can find this. If I can find it, it would help us. I'm still here. I'm not gone away.
Okay.
Well, I still can't figure this out. I'm going to try to go ahead. I know it. Well, wait a minute here now. Yeah, that's what I already have.
Okay, it's starting to come up now. Let me see.
Okay,
Oh.
you can see it.
No, I see. Whatever screen you had up popped up. It's blank again now, but it was something was on there.
You see anything now?
No, sir. Now I can. It says chapter 14 study questions.
What? I'm sorry. What did you say?
It said, yeah, I can see it now. Chapter 14 study questions.
Okay, you do see that.
Yes, sir. It
All
just
right. Well, all right. Well, then we can go ahead. Okay. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm not sure what I did. I'm still going to have to get this fixed, and I hope I can upload it tomorrow morning so you'll be able to double check it that way. The first couple things here on this particular slide are pretty simple. Authentic leadership. What does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it says. It means being true to yourself. You'll find that depicted on the slide other places, but that just means, authentic. Authentic means real, and it doesn't mean anything different than that. And that's what it says. It means that you are what you are, and you're not trying to be something different. Pardon me. Now, this particular slide is going to talk a little bit about. We're going to lead into moral leadership in just a little bit. But what we come here to now is that you as a leader, if you're your personality, and if it's a positive personality, is going to affect your followers. Now, I use the word affect. It says influence here, but if you use the word affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, that's what that word means. It means to influence. And notice the next thing it's going to talk about here is self-efficacy. And if you remember, we've talked about self-efficacy a little bit in other chapters, and I said I was going to present more about it in chapter 14, and here we are. Self-efficacy is a term that was invented, if you will, by a gentleman by the name of Albert Bandura. He's a professor at Stanford, and he did some seminal work on this. He was the first person who really talked about self-efficacy, and he tied that up as part of his study and research into what's known as social cognitive theory. Now, according to Bandura, and I want to give you this because it is not so much different from what the text has to say, but it's important that you hear what Bandura has to say about self-efficacy because he's the father of self-efficacy. He said self-efficacy is the belief in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of action required to manage prospective situations. In other words, according to Bandura, self-efficacy is a person's belief in his or her ability to succeed in a particular situation. He described these beliefs as determinants of how people think, behave, and feel. Now, Bandura goes on to say that people with strong self-efficacy view challenging problems as tasks to be mastered, develop a deeper interest in the activities in which they participate. If you will, that's taking ownership. Form a stronger sense of commitment to their interests and activities. Again, ownership, at least as far as I'm concerned. And then they have an ability to bounce back quickly from setbacks and disappointments. So they don't let those hold them back. Bandura goes on to say that people with weak self-efficacy or negative self-efficacy is probably a good way to talk about this. Do not take on challenging tasks. In other words, they walk away from them. They don't want to be involved in anything that is difficult. Believe that difficult tasks and situations are beyond their capabilities. Now that's the reverse of taking ownership. That's saying, nada, not for me. I need to stay away, hands off. Focus on personal failings and negative outcomes. So what you should see, and I have one more to give you here as well, what you should see in this is the difference between a positive outlook and a negative outlook. It's the difference between I control what's going on and the thought process that things outside me control what's going on. In other words, my environment. The difference between I control the environment in which I'm working as opposed to the environment controls me. Quickly lose confidence in their personal abilities. So that's the difference between the two of them. And then if you look at the last major word on this slide, it talks about optimism. And that's what everything is in self-efficacy. It's the belief of success. The glass is half full instead of half empty. And here are some other things we talk about. Hope means looking for more than one way to do something. And resilience, not being deterred by adversity. This is that able to bounce back, to recover. So it's something that we get into quite frequently, and we talk about, and we know people who fall on both sides of that spectrum. Those who believe they can do and will be successful, and those who believe they can't and won't and don't try. Now, I think we have to remember that what I just gave you is a sort of what I like to call a one over the world type thing. For the most part, everybody probably doesn't fall on either side of that spectrum completely. But the propensity to fall in one area, optimism, or the other area, negativism, probably resonates with people more often than not, or a particular person more often than not. Pardon me. Spiritual leadership. This is something that comes from within and is based upon deep-seated internal values and attitudes. Well, I want to caution you here, and I'll caution everybody, is do not think of spiritual leadership or do not equate spirituality with religion. You can be religious and be spiritual, but you can also be spiritual and not religious. Now, let me give you the classic example. It's the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is a very spiritual person, but he doesn't really belong to any religion as we think of religion. So this is not meant to take religion apart. It is not meant to say that any one particular thing. What it is meant to say is that just because a person is religious does not mean he or she is spiritual. A spiritual is an indwelling. It's something that comes from within, and it's something that just going to a church or belonging to an organized religion is not going to get you there. Now, if you do belong to a religion and you're professed in that religion and you continually go to your place of worship, the chances of you becoming spiritual are greater. Doesn't mean it'll happen, just are greater. The causal model of spiritualism or spiritual leadership is based on altruism, which is unselfish behavior. By the way, we can see this in figure 14.1 in the text. Vision. Where do we want to go? So if you look at figure 14.1, it's a work in a calling, if you will. And again, we have hope and effort, able to go the distance. So it's something that is very interesting to think about, and something that is we don't necessarily always see. Now, the next thing is a concept called servant leadership. And this was developed by a gentleman by the name of Robert Greenleaf. That's mentioned here in your text on page 322. And there's still a Greenleaf Institute in Indianapolis, Indiana at Butler University. And servant leadership is really based, as the slide says, on the premise that the only way you can lead or be a leader is to be a servant first. And Greenleaf espoused 10 principles, and I'm going to give them to you. Listening. Servant leaders must reinforce those important skills by making a deep commitment to listening intently to others. Now, just take that and go back to our discussion in chapter 11 on communication. Acquiring good listening skills. Empathy. People need to be accepted and recognized for their special and unique talent, or spirit, as he says. People need to see them as people, even when forced to reject behavior or performance. Healing. Excuse me. One of the great strengths of servant leadership is the potential for healing oneself and others. Awareness. general awareness, and especially self-awareness. We're back to self-awareness. Strengthens the servant leader. Persuasion. Servant leaders rely on persuasion rather than positional authority in making decisions. They seek to convince others. Conceptualization, the ability to look at a problem, or an organization, if you will, from a conceptualized perspective that means one must think beyond day-to-day realities. I'll give you an analogy to the world today, and that's climate change. We have a hard time, we humans have a hard time accepting climate change because we think of climate change as the weather. And the weather does not change drastically enough for us to see that there is change in the general overall climate. It's very difficult for people who are not scientists or not scientifically inquisitive inclined, or inclined to be inquisitive about science, maybe is a better way to put that. It's very difficult to see that. And that's what I'm trying to say here, this conceptualization. We see day to day. We don't necessarily always see the large picture. Foresight enables servant leaders to understand lessons from the past. There's an old story of people who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. People will tell you, had we learned from our mistakes and or paid attention to mistakes from the signing of the Versailles Treaty and done some things at intervention, we could have avoided World War II. A lot of other people would not necessarily agree with that, but it has a lot of thought process to it. Stewardship. Greenleaf's view of all institutions in which CEOs, staff, directors, and trustees all play significant roles in holding their institution in trust for the greater good of society. Commitment to the growth of people. Servant leaders are deeply committed to a personal, professional, and spiritual growth of each and every individual within the organization. And finally, building community. Servant leaders seek to identify a means for building community among those who work within a given institution. If you want to get this for yourself, you can go to www.butler.edu, and it should take you to servant leadership, or you can just go to Google and click on servant leadership, and that'll tell you. It's probably an easy way to do it. Go to Google or another search engine and click on servant leadership, and it will bring you to a lot of the work that Robert Greenleaf did. And this is his son talking about moral leadership. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. How strong your leadership values, you can look at, there's a survey to take based on Mick Yates' 4E's leadership framework, and you can get immediate results, immediate feedback from what you put in there. Transformational leadership. We hear a lot about transformational leaders, and in some cases, transformational leadership, which is equated with charismatic leadership. Remember, we talked a little bit about that last week, is, I don't want to say overblown, but I think it's overused. And people are always looking for transformational leaders, and they seldom find what they're looking for, because I think they put too much hope into what they think they're going to find, or they're looking for something that's almost unattainable. But it is true that transformational people who are leaders tend to look at the big picture. They talk about what we stand for. And if you have ever experienced a transformational leader, they tend to use words like we and collective pronouns to drive forward the thought process that it's everyone, they're going to make this thing, even though that one particular person is actually in charge, if you will. And then they appeal to the intellect. They're appealing to people's minds. They're actually making people think about what it is that they want to do. Now, here is slide 14.2, or excuse me, figure 14.2. You can see in your text on page 323. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I ask you to look at the similarities and differences with ethical leadership with the three that we've talked about here: authentic leadership, spiritual leadership, and transformational leadership. And you will see that there's a lot of commonality. Integrity runs through each of them. A concern for others, or altruism, as we talked about before, we find in each one. We find ethical decision making in two. We don't find it in spiritual, although I would submit to you that it is there. We find role modeling. And so there's a lot of commonalities here. And I encourage you to look at that and to get out of it what you can get out of it for yourself, not so much from listening to me or reading the lecture notes. I think that reading that, having heard me giving a little bit of an overview, and then thinking about it yourself will take on a greater meaning for you. Shared leadership is probably a difficult concept for most Americans to accept. We are an individualistic society. It does not make any difference if you or your family has been in the United States long enough. It does not make any difference what your ethnic background is. You become an individualist eventually. And there are probably some you're going to say, oh, well, that's not true. Yeah, I would suspect that maybe if we still have some fairly intact Indian tribes, they tend to be more collective. There may be some other pockets of collectivity within the United States, but by and large, we're an individualistic society. And that's how we approach things. I'm not necessarily saying that's right. It's just the American way. So shared leadership is what it says. It tends to be self-directed. Individuals and teams lead one another. Notice it uses the term individual. Yeah, but what they're saying here is that this is a collective. That the team cannot be, one person cannot be greater than the team. And as you know, if they achieve synergy, that means they're getting more out of the team than they would out of any one individual by him or herself. And so it's a different type of effort. So self-directed is there. It's something that we can see, and we see that mostly in teams. I like to say we don't see it as much in groups because a group is much different than the team. I've tried to stress that through the course, and I hope that you can see that difference. It's not so much that paying attention to what I have to say, but seeing that there's the difference between a team and a group. A team is where all members hold themselves collectively accountable to completing a task or achieving a task. That's not the same as true in groups because groups tend to be more fraternal. You usually have a leadership within a group, but they don't become a team. Here are some necessary conditions for successful team performance. We've talked about these before. I don't think we need to discuss them completely again, but we can look at some of them. A team to be successful has to have the right tools and has to have them in the correct number, if you will, correct quantity, better word to say. Otherwise, it can't be successful. They have to have competent team members, and they have to be motivated to achieve, to attain success. They have to be supportive. We talked about that back in chapter 8 and in chapter 7. If they don't get along, if there's not a social fabric, not a social facilitation here, it's going to fall apart. And then lastly, there have to be a commitment to continuous improvement. This is a concept called self-leadership, and I think it's not anything different than individualism in a way, except individuals don't always exercise leadership, and this here we're talking about leadership. So what we have here is you have to have people who are goal-focused. In other words, they know what the task is, and they're focused on task completion, task attainment completion. They have an inner satisfaction for achievement. Remember, if you go back to what we talked about in chapter 6, intrinsic rewards or extrinsic rewards. Remember that an intrinsic reward comes from satisfaction of doing something. You don't need somebody from the outside telling you what a great job you did, because you already know that. And then constructive thought pattern. I would like to say this a little bit differently. It's critical thinking. It's the ability to see something and to think through it. This talks about having a mental image of tasks, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's to critically understand what you have and then put the pieces together to move forward to successfully complete what you're about to complete. The next thing, this is what we're coming to that I say is kind of difficult to get in our minds. This is the Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness Research Program, GLOBE, G-L-O-B-E, headed by Robert House. We talked about Robert House in one of his motivation theories early on. And what we need to look here is at commonalities and what is effective. And so we're going to look at those as we come to the next slide, which is figure 14.3 in your text on page 328. This is a rather busy slide. We're going to get to this a little bit more often, a little bit later, and try to break this down and make a little sense into it. So we have societies and cultures and organizations, form, culture, practices, leader behavior, leader attribute and behaviors, acceptance, effectiveness, culturally endorsed leader theory, our leadership prototype. And we find that these will actually be fairly consistent across groups. Notice the dimensions here. We have people who are charismatic and value-based, team-oriented, participative. Remember, the participative means democratic. Now, we have to be careful with that because democratic does not translate well or easily to many other countries, even though they may have a participation. That's what democracy is. It's participation. People are oriented to being kind, humane, autonomous, and self-protective. Now, these are the cultural dimensions associated with leaders' effectiveness. And notice here we have vision, people, focus, democratic again. So we're into a lot of some of the same type of things that we've heard before. This is graphically displayed for you, not in a figure or a chart, on page 329. And notice what we have here: performance orientation, institutional collectivism, in-group collectivism, gender egalitarianism. Just simply means that we don't have gender inequality. Isn't that a radical concept? I mean, we think we don't have that in this country, and yet you go to the workplace and we find that women are making 80 cents on every dollar that a man makes. We can look at that and say, well, in the last 10 or 15 years, that gap has decreased from roughly 30 cents at the beginning of the 2000s, 70 cents to the dollar. It's now 80 cents to the dollar, but it's still not equality. They're very interesting things about how we do things. I don't know if you heard or read in the news, heard on the news, or read in the news that the CEO of Microsoft made a statement in front of a group of women. I don't remember what the exact forum was. I had it at home. I didn't bring it in with me. And said that women who don't ask for raises will be taken care of in the long run. So what he was really saying to a group of women who push equality is that keep your mouth shut and you'll be taken care of. And went on to the article that I read in the New York Times went on to say that the women who are seen as assertive usually wind up at the short end of the stick. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with it is we're culturally ingrained to think that men can be assertive, but women should not be. Why? That's crazy. That's what we're talking about here. Now, key dimensions of GLOBE, I think, are pretty easy to say that to be acceptable, we're going to find this a little bit more often. Excuse me. The leader must exhibit acceptable behaviors. In other words, he or she must exhibit behaviors that are accepted by that particular culture. And if they don't, they're going to be out of balance, and it's going to cause some problems. So notice that here at the bottom, and I want to read this to you because I think it's important for it to sink into us. Terms such as integrity and team-oriented are important, desirable leadership dimensions across most cultures. Now, it didn't say all, but across most. And I think that we can see the areas where it may not be as desirable simply because of the way the culture is, tends to be more autocratic or perhaps even paternalistic. Cultural change. Now, in this particular thing here, well, not so much cultural change, leadership. This simply means that we're going to take something in an organization and we're going to move from what the status quo is to something different. And we have to remember that anytime we do that, we're going to have some difficulty because, as I was trading emails with a different student today, I mentioned that humans, just like animals, are creatures of habit. We like to stay where we are. We're comfortable doing things the way we're doing them because it's easy for us. Change is always difficult. No matter how small the change is, it's difficult. And notice here, this change is we're taking people from where they are today, and we're going to create another atmosphere or another environment, is probably a better way of saying it, that's going to be just as good as this one is, as far as comfort and satisfaction and health and well-being of our employees, but it's going to move us to a new area, move us to a new way of doing things, hopefully for the better. Context just simply means that we're measuring everything that needs to be measured. And we're making sure that we're doing all the things we need to do to make this change easy for people to adapt to. Now, this particular slide, you can see that it's figure 14.5 at the bottom of page 333. Talks about context for our leadership action when we're going to have some change, organizational change. And we have four areas here we're going to talk about: stability, crisis, dynamic equilibrium, and near the edge of chaos. And as the slide will show you, actually the slide is, the figure is next, so we'll go to the figure. So we have a concept, we have desired leadership, and we have measured success. Well, stability is pretty easy to figure out because if it's actually stable, nothing's being changed, so we don't have to worry too much about it. So we want to have the procedures in place that promote stability. And then we're going to be able to measure that based upon what our performance goals are. We have crisis. We don't always know what's going to happen in a crisis. Crisis is difficult because it's not easy to determine. There's a threat to what's happening. So we tend to focus on the crisis itself and try to look at what caused it, what we can do to fix that, and we're going to need probably some type of transformational change as opposed to transactional. Transactional promotes a status quo. It promotes routine. So we can't have it. We need somebody with this vision. So what we want to be able to do is make some adjustment so we can handle the crisis, and then we want to get back to where we were, the status quo, or stability. A dynamic equilibrium just gives us an opportunity to make changes. And here we have the opportunity to stress things that we want to get done, because even though we're in equilibrium, it's dynamic, which means we may have some I don't want to use the word turmoil here, excuse me. I want to use the word of changes. So we want to be able to move to the areas that we've talked about. And near edge of chaos means we got lots of problems. And we have to realize we have order on one side and instability, it's going to be my term here on the next side, and we have to be able to bridge that gap pretty quickly. So we have to be able to be nimble, agile, and move forward. And we want to get back to the way we want to be. Look at those balance of stability and dynamic adaptation to increase fitness. Patterning of attention is simply this. It's separating the important from what's not important. I think I used the analogy of you're working for a car dealership or you own a car dealership and somebody comes to you and says sales are down. Well, we have to figure out what the problem is. And that is what I'm talking about, separating what's important from what's not important. We have to know what is there because we have a lot of information coming at us. And we have to be able to cut through that and see what's important and take action on the important things and let the things on the periphery take care of themselves. Transformational change, we've talked about this. Now, there are two kinds of changes, and most organizations actually take the latter, which is incremental change. Now, that's not to be said. I don't want you to think that incremental change is not as good as transformational change. I want you to see them as being fundamentally different. Transformational change is radical. We're making a big thing. We talk about this all the time, thinking outside the box. Well, we have this great, grandiose, wonderful idea, and we're going to implement it and change what we're doing today into adapting to this new technology, whatever it happens to be. most people have difficulty doing that because most people can't see far enough in the future to see how this transformational change will, or where this transformational change will take them. So most companies use incremental change. You know, Toyota is famous for incremental change, constantly improving what they have. Now, incremental change can be done one of two things. It can be improvements in processes and procedures to help you build a better product, or it could simply be incremental change to the product itself. So think of incremental change as being two ways of doing things. Focus on processes and procedures that we can change over time, or actually focusing on the product itself. Organizational targets for change and for planned change. And I think we have to think about that, because planned change is something that we can handle. We're in the driver's seat when it comes to planned change. We've made a decision. If you're familiar with Kurt Lewin's theory, he talked about the three-step process of change. The first one was to unfreeze what you have. In other words, take what you have and don't make it no longer concrete. Make it fluid. Then come to your next state, the state that you want to be in, and put that into practice, and then refreeze. So here we're having just a number of different things that are ripe for change. And then we have to look at change culture. We have strategy, culture. People should be employees here, technology, structure. We don't need to talk about any of these particularly, but we do need to understand that the things that we're talking about here are, for the most part, planned change. Now, the one I want to talk to you about that may not be planned change is technology. As we know, or at least I hope we know, although we may not be paying a lot of attention to it, the technology that we use today is changing as we speak. This is more true today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or even maybe 50 years ago. I speak to that, and I want to give you sort of an example. In the late 1940s, well, sometime in the 40s, but I think it was the late 1940s, Thomas Watson, who was the founder of IBM, and some of his friends and business associates and peers thought that they only needed 4 supercomputers to hold all the information in the world. Well, that's a wonderful concept, except when you stop and think that the PC that you have on your desk, at your office, at your home, holds more information than those 4 supercomputers would have held. Huge change. So that's why I say sometimes technology, while you can plan to make change in technology, sometimes the technology changes so fast that that really causes unplanned change. Now, the next we're going to come to is power change strategies. So we have to be able to mobilize the power we have as leaders to implement change. We want to influence people, but not only influence people, but we have to get their buy-in for the planned change. Now, again, here we're talking about planned change, not unplanned change. So we have a number of ways to do this. The first strategy mentioned, by the way, you can see some of this at the bottom of page 338, figure 14.7. Pardon me. Forced coercion. This is not a good tactic to use. I have written in my notes here, don't attempt it, because you're using authority, you're using rewards, or the ability to take rewards away from people, maybe you want to call them punishments, to get temporary buy-in for this change. It will not be long lasting. So do not attempt that. Rational persuasion. Remember we talked about persuasion with transformational leaders? Rational persuasion is bringing people in who have expertise in a certain area, trying to provide empirical support and relying on rational explanation arguments to push forward what you want to do. Using this strategy will normally get you long-term buy-in. The shared power strategy is another good tactic. It may be the best, because what you're doing here is you're actually involving the people who are going to be affected by the change in helping to plan the change. What a radical thought. We're actually going to go out and we're going to talk to the people who are going to be most effective and say, look, we need your help to plan this thing so you'll be able to hit the ground running. Not only are they going to be able to be on the plan, but they're going to be help us make decisions as we go along. And if you do use this type of strategy, you're going to get long-term buy-in. One of the biggest things that people don't like is to have something foisted on them when it's quite possible that something else could have been done better and less expensive. Resistance to change. Well, as I said before, we know this. It happens. We have to expect it. A lot of it comes down to don't want to, or it's no good, won't work. Even though we've not tried it, it's not going to work, won't happen. We're not interested in it. Go away. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And here are some of the let's just look at this. These are strategies of dealing with resistance, but let's look at those. Pardon me, where they come from. We're not going to talk about it. They don't like the change itself. They don't like the change strategy. They don't like the change agent. All of those things, any one of them, all of them, that's just the way it is. And some of what I said, don't like it, don't want to, won't be any good, etc. The slide that I have up here now, figure 14.8, which you can see in your text on page 341, and which will come up next, which is our last slide, talks about how to try to overcome this. And I'm not going to talk to all of these. I'm only going to mention 3 of them: education and communication, participation and involvement, and then facilitation and support. I don't mention the last 2 particularly because they are useless strategies to even try to implement. And because as far as I'm concerned, it's trickery. It doesn't get long-term buy-in, won't get long-term buy-in. And as soon as people see through the trickery you've used, what you've tried to do is going to be shot full of holes. Negotiation agreement, it's possible, but you're better off if you get these first, because these first 3, because they're probably better for you. And you just have to understand that education and communication is going to be costly and time consuming. But you have to get this to people who don't have the information. Participation and involvement goes back to getting buy-in. Again, you have to realize it's going to be time consuming, and if it's time consuming, it's going to be costly. And then facilitation and support, again, time consuming, again, probably expensive, but it's helpful because you're helping people adjust to what the issue is, and it's probably one of the better of the 3 ways to get across. Like I say, 2 of them I don't like at all. Won't talk about them. And negotiation agreement is possible, but probably will cause problems in the long run because you're making deals and people are going to look for other deals. By 5:31, let's take a break. That brings us to the end of chapter 14. We'll put that down and we'll bring chapter 15 up and talk about organization, culture, and innovation. Let's take about a 4-minute break and come back at 5:35.
Yes, sir.
Okay, 5:35, we're back. Short break, but I don't want to keep us going too long since it took a little bit of time to get us started tonight. And I hope, as I mentioned before, that I'm going to be able to upload this tomorrow. I have no idea, and I won't find out probably till tomorrow morning. Now we're going to discuss organizational culture and innovation. We're probably going to home in a little bit more on culture, and innovation comes toward the end of the chapter. So we hope to answer what is organizational culture, how do you understand an organization's culture, what is innovation and why is it important, and then how to manage organizational culture and innovation. Well, simply put, organizational culture is all the things that make us us. And we learned that in chapter 4. It's what makes us us. It makes us different from everybody else. What sets us apart. It's who we are, what we stand for. It's all wrapped around here about shared culture and vision and values and things of that nature. We look here at what is called an external adaptation, using a scorecard to measure goal achievement, knowing how to get there and developing ways to understand and learn from successes and failures. Fairly simple, but at the same time, it's a little on the complex side if we stop and think about it. Now, these are the important aspects of external adaptation. Again, we're looking here, if you want to take this first bullet of having information, and then we're putting that information into some kind of sequence, if you will, for lack of a better term, and we're assigning a priority to it. And we're assigning a priority based upon the importance of what we have. Developing ways to measure how well we do things. And then last, something we probably don't think of, but we do all the time. We're going to create a story, that's my term, or a reason, maybe that's a better way of saying it. We're going to make a statement of what caused us not to reach the goals that we set out to reach. It says they're talking about having something made up to talk about what turns out to be our failures. Sometimes what people do is you'll find, you maybe have encountered this in your life, a goal has been adjusted. We haven't been able to reach what we set out to reach, so we adjusted the goal so we can then say we achieved success. Now, is that wrong? I think you kind of have to look at the situation. Maybe the goal was over optimistic, and lowering the goal was not only more attainable, but was more realistic. So we have to think about those things. Sometimes it doesn't sound real well, but it may be better in the long run to do that. So here is what we want to talk about here. What are we really supposed to do? What is it we can do to get there? How do we measure results? What do we do if we don't meet our goals? That's making up an answer. The last one is probably as important as all the rest of them. When do we know how to quit? Remember we talked before about escalating commitment. We have to have an answer for when is enough enough. When is the time to continue to fish, or when is the time to cut bait? We have to have that answer. It's very important to have that answer. Internal integration is different from external, because here we're talking about the collective and the greater good. Collective being us. What is it that helps us get along? What makes us work together? What makes us who we are? Now, this is a question that comes to you about your experience. Recall a job that you either have now or you had sometime in the past, in your orientation during the first day or during your first week or however was it. What kind of orientation was it? Was it formal? Did you meet in like a classroom or an auditorium and have people talk to you? Was it informal? Or was it both? Did somebody give you the rules and procedures and policies? If you went to HR and HR conducted some of it, you probably got those rules, policies, procedures, etc. And it has to be. I mean, you can't say no, we can't have that. And hopefully, if it's a big enough organization, you were given an employee's manual pardon me, that had expected behaviors and do's and don'ts in it. Were you told about your department, or were you taken to the department and then somebody in the department conducted an orientation there, an orientation to the actual workplace, your work setting, your cubbyhole, if you will? And then did you meet the people you're going to work with? So what this whole slide here, talking about what your experiences are, this is where in this orientation, if it's not done well, it's going to lead to ultimate failure. Now, failure here means the person is going to realize pretty quickly that he or she doesn't fit into this organization or start looking to go elsewhere. Very costly. Hire somebody in the job, no matter what his or her position is, cost you to do the recruiting and do the advertising and the rest of that kind of stuff, and then go through the orientation. And if it's not done well, the person's going to say, hey, I need to be out of here. Hopefully it's done right, there's successes, and you meet the person's expectations. You don't meet the expectations, you can expect that person to walk very quickly. This is a very interesting slide because it talks about how we get along with others. And it talks about working together, and it's getting along. We talk about things here. Look, the slide talks about the first bullet: power and status, authority, understanding who's going to be rewarded and who's not going to be rewarded. Now, that's pretty simple as far as I'm concerned. If you do your job or you exceed expectations, you should get some type of reward. And a corollary to that is if you don't exceed expectations, you probably should not expect a reward. So that shouldn't be too difficult to figure out. And then we have to figure out how we're going to communicate, how we're going to get along, what our friendships are going to be, what our relationships are going to be. And relationships also talk about reporting relationships. So it's not just working here across from each other, lateral relationships, it's up and down relationships as well. Now, these are internal integration questions. What is it that makes us unique? Not so much how does the world see us, but how do we see the world? Do we see the world as a friendly place, a place to do business in? Or do we see it as an adversary? I'm talking about, I shouldn't say world, I should say the outside environment. Who belongs, who doesn't? Do we have rules for that? Probably do. And we say what they are. And how we do this allocation of power, etc. And then the last two we talked about, relationships and how we communicate. Now I want to point out to you this next particular slide about subculture. It's very important I point this out to you because if you look at the definition of subculture in the margin, it is incorrect. It says, and I'll read this to you, subcultures, this is on page 350, are groups who exhibit unique patterns of values and philosophies not consistent with the dominant culture. That's in the margin. If you read inside, it says a philosophy that is consistent with the organization's dominant values and philosophy. Now, I just want to point that out to you because if you do your summary, do not use what's in the margin because that's incorrect. I have gone back to other editions of this text and verified that the margin definition is not correct. So a subculture is a group of people working within the organization. And while they are a subculture, they're not necessarily part of the dominant culture. What they believe in and aspire, etc., is not inconsistent with the dominant culture and values of the organization. And if you can see the slide, that's exactly what the slide says, which is contrary to what's in the margin on page 350. I can't explain that. It's an editorial error. It's a bad one, but fortunately, I can point it out to you and say, hey, you know, the text editors made a mistake here. Don't compound their mistake. Now, counterculture is just the reverse of a subculture. Their their values and philosophies outwardly reject those of the dominant culture. So if you have a counterculture, you've got a problem. And you need to work with those folks to make sure that that gets changed. It does not continue. Because these folks, if left alone, can and will cause trouble. If it sounds like I'm emphasizing that, yes, I am. I wish I had a personal experience I could relate to you. I do not, but I do know that countercultures will cause problems. Now, these are what are known as problems associated with importing societal subgroups from the larger society. Now, one of the problems that you're doing, sometimes this is done in the guise of diversity. And if you go back to what we learned in chapter 2 about Xerox's experience, I looked at Xerox's experience and the case study that we had, case study number 2, we find that Xerox found a problem when it went out and brought minorities into the workforce. Now, they did it for an altruistic region, or they promoted for an altruistic region. They were doing this as our response to the race riots that we had in the United States in the 1960s. Caused big cities lots of angst, lots of problems. Now, I'm not here to talk about whether or not they were justified. In many cases, they probably were. Some cases, it was Me Tooism or copycatting, and didn't hold the same kind of issues that other places did. But regardless, remember about perceptions. Perception's reality, and what people see is different. So anyway, Xerox said this is as a reaction to, a response to, not as a reaction to, as a response to the race riots. And I said, well, you know, this probably ought to be good for us to do this. Well, what did they find? They find as soon as they brought minorities in, they were going back out the door the other way. So they didn't solve anything. They had a revolving door. It's only when they found out and understood that they had to not only recruit minorities, but they had to give minorities equal opportunity at promotions, rewards, schooling, training, whatever that happened to be, that they were able to keep minorities. And minorities have been successful in getting into moving into being promoted into high positions at Xerox. But they had to learn the hard way about the problem. So if you actually import these folks, you're probably going to wind up creating a counterculture if you're not careful. And you're going to have difficulty in doing that. And one of the things that happens here, and it must be avoided, is they bring these groups from society, importing societal subgroups. And I say they is general, it's not meant to be anybody in particular. And they assign these people to the same type of job, instead of bringing people in and placing them in positions in the company for which they're qualified. They put them all in the same job. I'm just going to say it's janitors or something else. That's a recipe for disaster. So notice here the last thing, embracing natural divisions from the larger culture may lead to difficulty in developing sound international operations. So something has to be thought about. I'm not going to dwell on multicultural organization. Remember, we talked about this in chapter 2. We have to be careful about this. We think this is good, but it tends to be exclusive. So we need to use the mantra today, which is known as inclusive. And so we want to include people, give them opportunities, and people will succeed or not succeed based upon their ability. That's the way things ought to be. Well, here's what organizational culture is. So what it's made up of is, and we're going to get to the slide next that gives us a pyramid view of culture. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. This is 5 steps for developing a multicultural organization. Pluralism ought to be an objective, and that's not just something that we think we ought to do because it makes us look good. There ought to be some basis for it and some grounding for it. Now, when I say that, that does not mean to sound like I'm making things up or making it more difficult, but it needs to be built into the fabric, pardon me, of the company and the culture so that people see the value. Just bringing something in to solve a problem seldom works. There has to be some rationale for what you're doing, why you're doing it, and having that commitment to making things better. Notice that second bullet, what I said before, making sure that when you do this, when you bring people in, they're not automatically pigeonholed in a certain type of job. That's nuts. People are going to see that for what it is. Integrate the informal networks by eliminating barriers and increasing participation. Break the link between group identity and identity of the firm. Now, what that simply means is that you are an employee of XYZ Corporation. You're not an employee of the accounting firm in XYZ Corporation. What that does the other way around is it says that the accounting department is more important than the organization. That's like the tail wagging the dog. Doesn't happen. And then we need to work on removing interpersonal conflict. Figure 15.1, which you can see on page 353. This is the culture that people see. Observable cultures at the top. That's what we can see that. Shared values is built upon shared values, and then the common assumptions. So these are the 3 things here: observable culture, shared values, common assumptions. Observable culture is what we see. This is what we do. Shared values speaks to the whole, as opposed to a micro. And then, matter of fact, if we can look at this, if you look at shared passions at Microsoft, gives you some kind of an idea of what we're talking about. You can read this at the top of page 354. And then the common cultural assumptions take for granted. These are self-evident truths, deepest and broadest layer. Just go back to that a second. You can see the common assumptions are at the bottom and they form the basis. Now we get this culture. This culture is built. This culture is imbued upon employees through heroic accounts of what the organization has done, specific accomplishments. And it's often based upon truth, but in many cases that truth is embellished a little bit. So it's not, it's grounded in truth, but it's not 100% truthful. There's been some changes there. Then we have rights. We know these, and we know what they are. The Japanese have certain rights in their business. They do certain things all the time. And they do them for certain reasons. So some Japanese companies get people together and have exercises in the morning. I don't know if some of the larger ones like Toyota still do that, but many of them do. And they talk about a commitment to the company and bringing that forward. So it's something that's done all the time. Of course, some rights are done at certain times to influence people and to drive home what the company culture is all about. Cultural symbols, these are things that we know what they are. They can be objects, it can be art, could be an event that transmit some type of meaning. And they use a very good analogy here using Brown. And UPS has, or did for a while, I haven't heard for some period of time, but asked the question on their advertisements on television, what can Brown do for you? Big Brown's associated with UPS. As soon as somebody says Big Brown, you know who that is. Unless you're a racehorse fan, there was a Big Brown racehorse that won the Kentucky Derby a few years ago, but he was named because of UPS Big Brown. Now, shared values. A list outlining what constitutes a strong culture. And this can be found on page 357 in your text. Notice it talks about creating activities and turning them into, well, I like to say teaching activities, if you will, or teaching events about who we are, what we are, etc. Tying the organization to important values within the company. A company can benefit from this. And it's a belief in what we do. And we think that what we do gives us an advantage over our competitors. Very important to think about those things. Now, shared values here, fairly easy to what they do for us. They reinforce our image, help us to retell who we are. Hopefully, it gets everybody in the organization to have this collective commitment, pardon me, to doing well and succeeding. It helps promote stability. Remember, we spend over a third of our lives at work on a daily basis. And so if we're not in this social network, this social work network, we're going to have some issues. If we're constantly butting our heads, I'm just talking about individual here, constantly butting our heads against the wall, we're going to have a problem. That's an issue of a company having a counterculture. It's defeating. And then notice also here it talks about reducing bureaucratic control. I like to point out here, and I pointed out, I think earlier, that bureaucracy is not just with the federal government. Bureaucracy is every place. One of the most bureaucratic companies, and may still be, for many, many years in the United States, was General Motors. And it's just companies that are large have a bureaucracy. And they're always going to have it. It's what has to be done is bureaucracies have to be managed, worked in certain ways that they don't overcome good. Characteristics of strong cultures. Notice here, it's a belief that what we do, these rites and these events and these rituals, are important because they help us gain a common identity or help us reinforce the common identity. It helps us, these are informal rules, notice this, and procedures that we have that help employees understand what's expected of them. And a belief that what employees and managers do is important, and therefore it's essential for us to share information and ideas. Well, notice this next thing, organizational myths. Usually not true, but they're accepted because they help us redefine what we are. Issues, no risk bias, that's nuts. And this other business here is, I think I jumped ahead of myself. I apologize for that. It helps facilitate experimentation and innovation and allows managers to govern because of these myths that we have floating around. Innovation is not only creating new ideas, new processes, new ways to do things, and putting them to work. Pardon me. Is also the lifeblood of organizations. Organizations that do not innovate probably are not going to stay around for a long period of time. Now this chart, which is figure 15.3, and you can see at the top of page 381, talks about how we get things into the works, if you will. We have to have an idea. We have to experiment with that idea. We have to determine if it is viable. Slide here says feasible. It's the same thing. It's just a different word. Both the words mean a little something different, but they're virtually the same. Feasible just means, can we do it? Viable means, is it going to last over a period of time, or is it able to stand up and walk on its own, if you will? And then we have to put it into action. So this isn't going to happen if an organization does not have support for innovation. And I like to talk here just shortly about Post-it notes. I'm sure you know Post-it notes. You've used Post-it notes. You probably use a knockoff of Post-it notes today. The fellow by the name of, that's awful. I can't think of his name right now. That had it on tip of my tongue. Worked for, last name was Fry. I'll do that. Worked for 3M Corporation, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, makers of Scotch brand cellophane tape. 3M is known as has an innovative culture. Just to illustrate, somebody has an idea that they believe that has application, and the folks at 3M who vet it think it does. They'll give this person a budget, give him or her a couple of years to bring the product to fruition, maybe a staff, resources, etc. And if after 2 years the product is a no-go, person goes back to his or her old job with no questions asked. Well, Fry was trying to make an adhesive, and the adhesive he was trying to make didn't work very well. But what he did find was that it helped him when he was a member of his church's choir. He could use the sticky stuff to separate the pages in his hymnal so he could turn to them very quickly. Well, he saw an application. So he sent his bosses a note with Post-it notes stuck to it, and they didn't think much about it. Well, he persisted and kept sending Post-it notes, so they finally did think something about it, and they brought the product to fruition. But they couldn't get the people that sold their products, in other words, their wholesalers, to take the product. And the only way the product ever really got to market was the marketing people at 3M got a list of the corporate secretaries at Fortune 500 companies and sent them Post-it notes. Well, the corporate secretaries wanted to know where they could buy them. So all of a sudden, Post-it notes became a success. So here you had an innovative company, or a company known for innovation, that really wasn't interested in the Post-it notes. Then when they found out the Post-it notes had application, after Art Fry was the guy's name, I couldn't think of it for a minute. After Fry sent it around to his bosses with the notes stuck onto them, but it took another ounce of ingenuity to contact high rollers at Fortune 500 companies. So everybody needs innovation. It's not always as obvious where innovation comes from. So we have two kinds of innovation. We have product innovation, we have process innovation. Product innovation is exactly what it says. It is innovating a product, improving a product, or good, our service product being good for the most part, to make it better to meet what customers are looking for. Process innovation is making the way we do things to make that product or make that service available better. So in the long run, we actually wind up with a better product because it's cost us less money to make the product. So if now we're costing us less money, improving the process and the procedures, we become more efficient. We can sell the product for what we've been selling it for, but we're going to save money, make more money because it's not costing as much to make this product. Pardon me. Innovation does not stop. We have two ways of innovation: exploitation and exploration. Exploitation is just making better use of the resources we have. Many companies today are using things they call lean manufacturing, where they're using less raw material, fewer employees, et cetera, having less scrap. You know, if you have scrap left over, that's wasted product, wasted resource. So if we can reduce that to a minuscule amount, your profits have to go up. And then exploration is, I like to say, use the term thinking outside the box, thinking about things that never were, and working things in that nature. And management philosophy is very important here. If you have a management that is promoting goods and services of innovation, exploration, exploitation, you're going to be able to move forward. That they're looking for collaboration and ways to move the company forward, not only in innovation, but the way it does things, how it manages itself. Well-developed management philosophy establishes boundaries that people understand. And the boundaries are for everybody. They're not just for the few, or they're not just for the many. They're for everybody. It has a way of approaching situations that are consistent. It doesn't jump from this idea to that idea to some other idea without going through a pragmatic process of evaluation. And it holds people together by saying, we know what's good for all of us and we know how to get there. It's kind of like we like to say, talking to talking, walking to talk, and talking to walk. What happens here? Strategies for managing organizational culture. Don't stay abreast of change or won't. Reliance on the old ways. But set the tone. Keep the tone. Oh, excuse me, I'm the wrong slide here. I was my wrong notes. I apologize. Strategies for managing organizational culture. We need to keep these stories and rites and rituals alive. Have a reward system, and evolution and change for the market culture, setting a tone for the organization, kind of buttressing the previous slide. Now, obviously, we're going to make some mistakes. That's not anything new. We have to expect that. Trying to change from the top down simply does not work. It doesn't work because the people at the top many times don't understand what's going on at the bottom. And so what they don't understand, or the mid part, they don't understand that. They think they can sit in their corner offices and decree something, and it's going to happen by fiat. And it just doesn't happen, because people are resentful of that. They feel like they've not been talked to. Their thoughts and processes and et cetera, have not been taken into consideration. So don't try to change culture from the top down. You'll find in many cases that the culture is really imbued in people that have been around for a while, regardless of where they are in the organization. And so somebody upstairs all of a sudden decides he or she's going to do something without consulting everybody else in the organization. It's doomed to failure. It's not going to work. Organizational lag just simply comes not staying abreast of change, or won't stay abreast of change. Reliance on the old ways of doing things. We've always done it this way. How often have you heard that? It just says, I'm not open to change. I'm not willing to change. Not going to help anybody. Notice also here is an over-reliance on rule following, and then the reinforcement of the ways we used to do things. And finally, some ways to overcome cultural lag, show a relationship between what and who we are and the new thinking. And you have to have a balance between changing the rules and being able to follow the rules. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 15. Do you have any questions?
No, sir. No, sir.
All right. Now, as I said, I'm going to try to upload this, but as you know, I had some real issues here tonight with technology. Something happened on my computer. Icon's gone. I don't know where it went. So I'm going to try to do this, and I'll let you know if it's uploaded so you can watch it tomorrow if you wish.
That'll work. That'll
All right.
work.
Thank you very much. Talk to you again next week.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Good night.
sir. Good night. Good night.